When The Last of Us originally released in 2013, it was almost universally applauded as a masterpiece in video game storytelling, one that continues to resonate with audiences to this day. This legacy is a significant part of the strong reactions, good and bad, to the release of its remake, The Last of Us Part 1. It feels like so much of the conversation about the game at the moment isn't about the game itself, but about people's expectations and preconceptions. Even with the game now out and people actually getting to experience it firsthand, those pre-release opinions still dominate the online discourse. But none of that is really helpful in discussing what the game is actually like and whether it's worth your time. So, as I've actually had a controller in my hand and played it through long enough to have gotten the Platinum Trophy, let's talk about the game. Before we get to anything else, the elephant in the room with this game is that it costs £70, or $70 in the United States, and as such is priced the same as a brand new game coming out on the PlayStation 5. I'm not going to say that it's absolutely worth it or absolutely not worth it, because that's going to be subjective to you. For what it's worth, whilst there are games that launch at a lower price tag, a lot of the games coming out from a AAA space are a lot pricier now than in the past. Not only at £70, but up to £100 for various digital deluxe or similar editions. There's a problem with that as a whole, and that doesn't fall on the shoulders of Naughty Dog alone. What it comes down to is if paying full price for a brand new PS5 game is something that's worthwhile to you, and whether The Last of Us Part 1 qualifies as a brand new game. In terms of the latter point, hopefully this video will help you make up your mind. The first and most obvious point about this game is that it looks so much better than the original. The graphics of the 2013 game still hold their own fairly well, which is impressive in its own right, but it's not just the textures that are better looking, it's that everything feels so much more real. In terms of the story, which of course The Last of Us is best known for, this means that Naughty Dog is able to pull so much more raw emotion from scenes than before. Eye movements, facial expressions, body language, and much more subtle tics give you so much more of the characters and characterization, meaning that even if you've seen this story play out 100 times, it's still all the richer for the work put in and does so much more justice to the actors' performances. I'm not going to talk about the story in depth here, because if you don't know the story, then you should absolutely experience it for yourself rather than having it relayed to you in a YouTube video. The environment and lighting also make so many of the scenes not just look better, but feel more immersive and atmospheric. This feeds into the gameplay as well as the story, as the deeper darkness and better lighting feeds into feelings of tension and horror you feel in some of the more intense moments. The PS5's 3D audio and haptic feedback is also used to great effect in this game. Little details like feeling the rumble of a passing truck and the vibrations moving across the controller in the same direction as the vehicle on screen, or feeling the tension in the string of your bow as you pull it back, all add to the immersion in both the story and the gameplay. Other quality of life improvements from the original include the game's optional conversations. In some cases, these felt like an ordeal to get, having to do the exact things in the right order to trigger the prompt, or, in the case of Ellie's jokes, having to wait for an age while she wanders around in circles, and be standing in the right spot the whole time for her to get a joke book out. Now this is a lot more straightforward. It's a little thing, but trying to go through and get everything for the trophies, it was a great help. The load times for the game are next to non-existent. Not only with the seamless transitions from cutscenes to gameplay, but even if you skip the cutscenes, you're taken to the next part in mere moments, rather than the much longer load times of not only the original, but also The Last of Us Part 2. In terms of complaints, I did notice a couple of times when I had to get a collectible twice for the game to register it. I'm not sure if the game itself recorded the collectible, but the PS5 hint cards didn't. But either way, it did seem to affect trophy progression. There were also a couple of times where the ally AI just stood in my way and blocked my path for no real reason, but none of these were during combat. These are more nitpicks than proper criticisms, and there wasn't anything truly immersion or game-breaking on my playthroughs. All of the technical improvements are pretty much as advertised, but also as expected, given both the engine Naughty Dog are working with and the capabilities of the PS5. They certainly add to an immersive experience, but on their own, these things aren't enough to justify remaking the game. One of the key things that does is the accessibility. The Last of Us Part 2, when it released, was pretty much the most accessible game around. The Last of Us Part 1 snatches that title away from it, building in all the features the 2020 game had, but also expanding on them in some innovative ways. When you first turn the game on, you're put into the setup screens, and are invited not just to set up the brightness, audio and display, but also the accessibility options. The subtitles are fully customizable in terms of when they appear, their size, their background, whether names of speakers appear, the colour of those names, and whether they include directional indicators. All to make those subtitles as legible as possible and give deaf or hard of hearing players the same information as anyone else. You can apply presets for vision, hearing or motor accessibility, which provides a number of recommended settings for each scenario, but beyond that you can fully customize which options you utilize and their application. At its heart, accessibility is about allowing players to customize their experience as much as possible. No two players will have the same exact needs, and allowing that customization means that the game removes as many barriers as it can to anyone who wants to be able to play the game. This even goes down to the difficulty and challenge. There's an option to skip the game's environmental traversal puzzles, which is useful for players who may not find them fully accessible. Players who struggle with spatial awareness and reaction time can utilise the combat accessibility, such as enemies not flanking or being invisible in stealth when not aiming, and so on. Even the game's difficulty is customizable, and you can make it easier in terms of available resources but harder in terms of enemy aggression or whatever other combination you like. Pretty much any player can make The Last of Us Part 1 as easy or as difficult as they like, adapt settings and controls to their particular need, and enjoy the experience that follows. All without compromising the artistic vision of the developers, the usual argument against customization and accessibility, because it was baked into the game design from the beginning. There are areas the accessibility is lacking. There don't seem to be closed captions for environmental and enemy sounds, only subtitles for dialogue, which is a significant one. Navigation assistance also only points players to the way forward, meaning that those who need it are most likely to miss optional areas, exploration and collectibles. And although the option to skip puzzles will benefit some, there may be others who feel that they would want to play through them and so would want the puzzles themselves to be more accessible. Given the priority that Naughty Dog has given accessibility, I would hope that it'll pay attention to these shortfalls and address them. However, at the time of writing, it's worth being aware that these are issues if they would affect your experience. The Last of Us 2013 is known primarily for its story, and until Part 2 came out in 2020, there didn't seem to be too much discussion around the gameplay in the series. For good reason, given that the gameplay in the original is quite clunky and didn't exactly blow people away. While not terrible, it needed an upgrade. The Last of Us Part 1 doesn't play exactly like The Last of Us Part 2. However, it does benefit from the improvements that game made in areas such as enemy and partner AI, as well as the difficulty customization. Whilst the lack of dodge and prone options are notable in this game, having played it on both moderate and survivor difficulties, I think I understand the reasoning for this, and I'm of the opinion that it works. The way the dodge mechanic worked in Part 2 was balanced out by the fact that neither Ellie nor Abby could just keep spamming attacks until the enemy fell. Having dodge meant having to dodge. Joel can just beat on an infected until they fall. If a human ducks his swing, you can press triangle to counter and push them back, giving you the space to get in more hits. Though you can't do this if they have a melee weapon unless you do too, allowing you to block. And if a group of infected swarm him, he ducks to shield himself and you have to press L1 to barge free and move to where you've got more space. Where Part 2 had larger, more sandbox-like areas, the combat arenas in Part 1 are more linear and built around tight spaces. The challenge of these areas is rooted in Joel being slow and heavy, so you have to know when to use brute force, when to retreat to stealth, and be able to force an opening if overwhelmed. Ellie can't dodge or go prone either, of course, where she could in Part 2, but 19-year-old Ellie's abilities encourage you to get in close when you can and run and dive into cover when necessary. Whereas 14-year-old Ellie isn't strong and experienced enough to be diving in the midst of groups of infected with her switchblade, let alone humans. Not being able to do that means you have to use your speed to keep your distance, while the frantic urgency of her encounters means you still need quick thinking and to know when to fight or run. What we do get from Part 2 makes these systems both more evident and better. The clickers now use their clicking to find you, so it's not simply a case of being quiet and keeping your distance. You have to not get in front of them, making stealth through areas like the graveyard or the university dorms more challenging. Stalkers now actually play like stalkers instead of slightly broken runners. This both makes the areas they're in creepier and improves the balance. On survivor difficulty, you're more able to take them on in a fist fight, but their improved behaviour means that you need to be ready to run and not get swarmed. The human AI being smarter also makes those encounters more challenging and interesting. In some cases, mainly areas where your location isn't known, you can use the same basic strategies to sneak through areas as before, but a lot of these rely on knowing the precise route, such as the one through the Firefly Hospital. In ambushes though, where you have no choice but to kill all of the enemies, the way they coordinate and respond to your actions does make the encounters far more dynamic and challenging. Playing as Ellie, one significant improvement is that if an enemy gets close to you and swings, you'll take damage but still have the chance to run and recover, as opposed to the old system, where it felt as though them being within a certain distance of you triggered a one-punch death animation which felt frustrating and cheap. But, of course, you're still vulnerable and need to run, hide and pick your moments. If there were things that I would have loved to see from Part 2 that we didn't get, one was the inclusion of mixed infected and human areas in the base game. In some areas it would have messed with the design, but it could have worked in areas like the Pittsburgh Hotel, where the hunters are trying to clear out floors. Another was the occasional brute human. Not overdone, but once or twice having a beefier human with a big melee weapon for Joel to go toe-to-toe with might have been cool. Overall though, the combat in Part 1 feels like a significant improvement on the original. We didn't get prone or dodging, but the original's combat system and level design works so much better with the AI, infected types and broader improvements brought over from Part 2. The other aspect of the gameplay, which I've not focused on, is the environmental puzzles, the scavenging and the upgrades. I've always engaged with them on the basis that they complement the type of game, as well as a lot of it being what I'm used to from playing survival horror games, whereas I know opinions on the worth of this type of gameplay differ significantly. I think here the fact that you can play through the game without upgrading if you want, and that you can skip puzzles, mean that it almost doesn't matter if you don't like this sort of thing. You can engage or not as you choose. The game's main campaign takes about 10 to 12 hours on a first playthrough, depending on how much exploring and collecting you do, while Left Behind is about 3 hours. But in terms of replayability, there's definitely more than 13 hours of play in this game. The main campaign has New Game Plus, if you want to go through again with all of your equipment and upgrades. You can now choose both a classic New Game Plus, where, like in the original, you can't access each weapon or recipe until the point you did on your first playthrough, and one where you have everything from the beginning. As part of this, you can also continue to upgrade Joel and all your weapons, get all the collectibles and trophies you may have missed, and try out the game at different difficulty levels. On top of this, after finishing the game once, you can unlock cheats such as infinite ammo or infinite crafting, one-hit kills, and more. You also unlock aesthetics ranging from different outfits for Joel and Ellie, skins for their guns, and filters for the game itself. If you're the kind of person who always watched all the extras when you got a DVD, you can even play through the game with the director's commentary from Neil Druckmann, Troy Baker, and Ashley Johnson over the cutscenes. One of the best and most underrated features rolled over from Part 2 is the Encounters mode, where you can play any individual encounter from the game. You can play them in isolation, over and over, or in sequence, on any difficulty you like. The game drops you in with a random loadout based on that difficulty and lets you have at it. This allows for fun, quick arcade play if you're not in the mood for the story that day, and trying out different strategies for each area. Beyond that, if you really want to challenge yourself, then the three big things are the highest difficulty, Grounded, the speedrun mode, and the permadeath mode. Grounded is the highest difficulty on all the Last of Us games. Billed accurately is the most challenging and realistic experience. It's intense, demanding, and you'll die a lot on your first time through. But if you like hard games, then it's fun as hell. Permadeath is what it sounds like. You can choose by chapter, by act, or whole game, and when you die, your progress is reset accordingly. This is only for the bravest. Finally, speedrun mode gives you a timer to, well, speedrun the game. It also tracks your records and lets you compare with your friends who have the game, if you're the competitive type. In other words, there's an awful lot of content here to keep anyone who's interested in the game in the first place occupied. Of course, it's also lacking the multiplayer factions mode that was in the original game. Naughty Dog's multiplayer team being busy working on a brand new, standalone The Last of Us multiplayer is of course a valid reason for this. I don't think the absence of the multiplayer is a significant flaw with this game, given all the other content it has. The original factions is still going strong to this day, and I don't think it's going anywhere, though I'm also not sure how many new players it brings in rather than having a dedicated, long-standing base. That said, I can understand why people were disappointed with its exclusion here. What would be good to see, and I guess this counts as a direct plea to Naughty Dog, is if when the new multiplayer is completed, we were to get a Factions remake as a free DLC for Part 1. Bringing everything full circle, I can't tell you if all of that is worth £70 to you. But if you've never played The Last of Us before, whether because it was inaccessible to you or you just never got around to it, then this is the best version of the game you can play. If you're a fan of The Last of Us who has played it a million times, then this game will still wow you and give you something new. The Last of Us Part 1 delivers exactly what was promised, the definitive edition of the game and the story that so many fans know and love. This version looks better, plays better, offers far more customization, is far more accessible, and has more different modifiers, modes, and unlockables to try out than the original. It's a great game, and a fantastic remake. If you enjoyed this video, then give it a like and consider subscribing to keep up to date with all my content, like the video that's just popped up, which YouTube thinks you should watch next. Check out the link in the description to my Patreon to support the channel directly and get perks like shoutouts and early access to videos. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.
Whoa! How the hell would he even walk around with that thing?
Get rid of that.
Hold your horses. I want to see what all the fuss is about.